So hi everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on how is COVID-19 transforming M&E. My name is Samir Hafiz, and I'm a researcher for M&E at LNAP. For all of us who are working in monitoring and evaluation, our work has been impacted by COVID-19 in a large and unexpected way, from restrictions on in-person data collection to increased difficulty in engaging evaluation users during the pandemic. There have been significant practical and strategic challenges that M&E practitioners have had to respond to very quickly. So some of the ways in which we have adapted may just be temporary to plaster over the cracks during a difficult time, whilst others may be more long-lasting changes to how we approach humanitarian M&E, and really using this as an opportunity to reflect on how we can do things differently or even better. So I'm joined today by several guest speakers who will all briefly share their experiences on how COVID-19 has impacted their approaches to monitoring and evaluation. Together, we will be highlighting some of the key takeaways from LNAP's recent skills building workshops, where over 100 M&E practitioners came together to reflect on M&E in the COVID context. In particular, we had 3 events that explored approaches to evaluation strategy and planning during the pandemic, key evaluation challenges and changes in evaluation practice during COVID, and the ethics, gaps and challenges in remote M&E and data collection. Each of these events was underpinned by its own background research paper, for which we conducted close to 20 key informant interviews and had workshop participants fill out a comprehensive survey to share their experiences of M&E during the pandemic. I'll show more details on the publication of this research at the end of the webinar. So what we are going to do for the next 45 minutes is have 3 mini panel discussions around each of the topics. If you have any questions for our guest speakers, please type them into the Q&A box. You should see at the bottom of your screen the Q&A function, and our guest speakers will be looking to answer them in writing throughout the webinar. We will also have time to put some of these questions to our guest speakers at the end of the webinar. So please use the vote up function to help us decide which questions get answered live at the end. I just want to flag that we have a lot of you joining us today. There may be a lot of interesting questions, so we may extend the Q&A past the hour mark by 10 minutes. We're going to see how it goes. Okay, so I'm going to kickstart the conversation with a few guest speakers who were all involved in our evaluation strategy and planning during COVID-19 workshop. So this workshop was facilitated by Margie Buchanan-Smith, a leading evaluator with 30 years experience in humanitarian action and who co-authored LNAP's Guide to Evaluation of Humanitarian Action. We also have with us Wendy Abziek-Bruce, Director of Independent Evaluation Service at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, and Ricardo Plastro, Regional Advisor for the Latin America and Caribbean region at UNICEF. Both Wendy and Ricardo took part in the learning exchange for evaluation leaders. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining me today. So my first question is to all 3 of you. Has there been any pushback on evaluation functions or challenges in engaging evaluation users during the pandemic? And how has this been handled? Margie, if you can start us off, please.
Yeah, thanks, Samir. Yes, I did hear quite a lot about this from key informants and also from participants during the workshop. And I think some, especially in larger agencies, did experience pushback from programme staff who, not surprisingly, felt quite overstretched and that they couldn't really engage in evaluation activity whilst they were in the early stages of responding to the COVID pandemic. But others, I think, interestingly, often NGOs, although not only NGOs, had a more positive experience. And what seemed to make the difference was the pre-pandemic nature of the relationship between the evaluation function and programme staff. So was the evaluation function experienced as being quite listening or supportive, or was it somehow seen as being perhaps a little bit more distant and imposing? But it also seemed to depend on where the evaluation function could tap into what one workshop participant described as a natural demand for learning and reflection across the organisation. And we know that there's long been a drive towards more utilization focused evaluation. And I think the importance of that has really been amplified in the last year. So ensuring that whatever proposed evaluation activity is coming up, that it really meets the needs, the learning needs of program staff from the early stages of the evaluation right through the evaluation. And interestingly, that's also required more of an emphasis on the soft skills of evaluation. So facilitation, strong interpersonal skills, really listening to the needs and the experience of program staff. And there's been a growing number of very interesting real-time learning experiences, a bit broader than the sort of conventional real-time evaluations, which seem to have worked well, especially where they've tapped into that desire to learn. And I think they've worked particularly well where they provided and facilitated a space to reflect, for program staff to reflect, and also where the real-time learning has fed back very quickly, maybe on an ongoing basis. So they've helped program staff who've been working, as we know, in very uncharted territory. They've really helped them to adapt and to learn.
Thank you, Margie. And the same question now to Ricardo.
Hey, thanks. Good morning, everybody. So yeah, there have been some pushbacks and some key challenges across the humanitarian system, and also for development actors responding to the COVID pandemic. Everybody was working flat initially. Now the key question over there was a little bit, what has the evaluation function to offer? What is the value add? It was initially perceived as a burden, with limited senior management buy-in, and it was being fully remote, and therefore it was a real challenge to ensure overall the quality of these initiatives. But that represented an opportunity, basically, because what you wanted to do is get back the evaluation on the agenda, don't lose ground. So what we did, and what also major actors across the humanitarian and development system did, was to delve into adaptive management reviews, real-time assessments or real-time evaluations for others, and also developmental evaluations. So there, the key element of what Margie was referring to, these utilization-focused evaluations, was an iterative engagement with users at different levels. And that swiftly opened learning spaces throughout organizations, not just within the country offices, which were responding flat to the emergency supporting national governments and local communities, but also at the regional and headquarter level. However, COVID-19 still represents, I think, a major challenge for regular global country program and thematic evaluations. But it helps us also innovate and think outside of the box, adapt the scope, the methods, and also prioritize questions in the evaluations we delve into. So it has brought and morphed the function, which was initially sidelined, but now is brought back to the fore as a strategic function that helps us take decision-making and adapt as we go. Over to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. And also, same question to you, Wendy. You're probably coming at this from a slightly different angle.
Thank you, Samir. Yes, my evaluation unit is at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. And yeah, I recognize there being some of a pushback, to the extent that the first reaction of lots of people was panic. How do we scale up? We're not really interested in monitoring and evaluation right now. And actually, the first thing I did was to actually write an email to the Secretary General of the Ministry and say, look, we understand that your mind is not into evaluation and monitoring, and neither is ours, really. We understand that this is a crisis, so can we be useful in any way? It doesn't have to be in terms of monitoring and evaluation. And I realized that that was a sort of act of humility that came out rather well, because the first thing they said was, no, we don't really need you people. And I said, well, I have to confess, we're not that practical. But the gesture was appreciated, and it was also appreciated that we were thinking along with them and not sort of immediately start warning, because that's what we could have done as well. So the gesture was appreciated, and very soon people started knocking on our doors to ask us, can you help us devise criteria so that we can scale up in a sensible and a balanced way, for instance. So that was the first move in which we were actually approached to think along with the policymakers, who were really doing lots of upscaling, or trying to do, and also increasing the spending. And we had we'd sent them some articles, and we'd also sent them a few lessons on what we know from quick spending, crisis spending in previous health crises, for instance, Ebola and so on, and SARS, and the sort of pitfalls that we know occur. So a couple of the quick lessons from these sort of pandemics, they went in quite well, and they realized, well, we better get the evaluation unit people in to think along with us on how to spend and to devise a few criteria. So initially, yes, some skepticism in the sense of, we have no time for evaluation, we don't have time for monitoring. But in the end, people realize, if we want to be accountable whilst being in a crisis, it would be good to have the evaluation unit people thinking along with us. But of course, as Margie said, and also Ricardo, the key point is to, as an evaluator, to think where are you needed most, and how can you be of help, rather than thinking from your own universe.
Thank you, Wendy. Now, Margie and Ricardo, one of the standout talking points for me in these learning exchanges was around the shift towards working with national evaluators and headquarter-based staff, providing more remote M&E support to decentralized units. So what were the key challenges or best practice that you've come across in relation to this in your work? If I put that question to you first, Margie.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Samir. Yes, it has been very striking. And of course, the big advantage is that national evaluators haven't had to travel internationally and face all of those restrictions. But in the words of one key informant, the experience in many ways has kind of broken the reliance on international evaluators. And I think that's seen as very positive. How national evaluators have played a greater role has varied. So sometimes they've taken a leading role and full responsibility for the evaluation exercise. Sometimes they've been mentored or supported by international evaluators. But I think where it's worked best is where the agency has had an established network of national consultants and evaluators that they've been working with before the pandemic that they could tap into. And I think agencies that haven't had that kind of network have found it harder to recruit strong national evaluators once the pandemic hit. I mean, as we know, evaluations benefit enormously from national evaluators' understanding and knowledge of their context, of the local context, the national context, and also from their contacts. And that may be particularly important where you're reliant on remote interviewing. So having some kind of relationship with key informant interviews may really help how openly they talk to you. And I think, this is a major opportunity for us to advance something in the sector that we've often talked about, which is how to strengthen national evaluation capability, learning from this experience and identifying where skills need to be strengthened. Because many national evaluators, haven't had the benefit of exposure to the same range of evaluation practices as international evaluators. So, they may be less experienced in some perhaps less conventional evaluation methodologies, such as outcome harvesting. That was one that came up, I think, in our workshop. But I think also very importantly, this has prompted a harder look at diversity. So I know that some UN agencies have actively sought to extend their framework agreements on evaluation to consultancy companies that come from low and middle income countries in a drive to expand the diversity of evaluation providers. And I think that's, that's a really positive development.
Thank you, Margie. And Ricardo?
Thank you, Samir. So overall, these travel restrictions and lockdowns have called all the actors to adapt the evaluation processes. Now, I think the experiences vary both across organizations and across regions. Some have opted for blended teams, mixing internal and external evaluators, opting fully for national consultants being mentored by the regional level, as we did in Western Africa. And others have opted to do this all in-house. So with the workforce you have at the decentralized level. And that includes also, obviously, a national workforce. Now, if we go back to the national consultants, I think it is a key issue which we've been working on, I think, in the last 10 years, and some have even integrated in their evaluation policies the need to have national consultants as a component of national evaluation capacity development. Now, this varies a lot if you take fragile, if you take low income, if you take middle income and high income countries. In middle income and high income countries, I would say the national workforce could be even more advanced from traditional OECD-DAC donor countries. If you look at the palette and the range of evaluation which influences national policies and budgets, because that's really at the end of the day the gist of the work in those circumstances. But overall, the key challenge has been the scarcity of good national evaluators that would speak the local language or the regional languages spoken. And there has been a huge competition within agencies, I would say, but also among agencies. So those have been the two variables there. The contextual understanding, the language skills, and I would say even not just the utilization focused experience or the outcome harvesting one, but I would say, an adaptive experience, which is at the core of humanitarian evaluation, was missing often with national evaluators. So the option to blend with internationals, which had that experience, was very important. Another challenge was the ethical dimension. It is related to transferring the risk to national evaluators. And we had a very interesting discussion among all the United Nations evaluation group at the beginning of the pandemic, when we said, well, but here's a big risk if we transfer that to national evaluators, and opting for a do no harm approach should prevail. And you have to avoid losing the perspective of the right holders. A person that does not have the language, the connections that Margie was referring to, or the contextual understanding, won't have the capacity to engage with effective communities, local governments, and those dimensions. Over to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. My final question is to Wendy. As an evaluation leader in your organization, what do you think are the long-term implications of COVID-19 on M&E practice?
Well, from the way that I look at it, and from our experience as a sort of relatively small evaluation unit, I think one of the long-term effects will be that we will think much harder and better on what the value added of our evaluations will be in the future. That's one thing. The first question that I always thought had to be top of mind is who are we doing it for, and what do they really need to know, as opposed to what we would like to know. But I think that the sort of COVID-19 event has really triggered that, or pop that up even more urgently. who are we doing this for, and what is the urgency of crossing across the globe or going across the globe to start evaluating. So I think it has forced us to be much more critical. It has also forced us to look much more carefully at what is the existing knowledge that is already out there on lots of specific issues. And that's always been one of my points towards my staff. Let's check first what's out there. Let's look at synthesis studies. Let's look at meta reviews. Let's look at all the evidence out there. And this is something that we will do much more rigorously, and then actually possibly also combine that with much more sort of ex ante evaluations, advising policymakers on lessons learned from the start of the new policy cycle, rather than doing an evaluation at the end of their policy cycle. So we will be advising much more upfront on the basis of existing knowledge. And I think the COVID crisis has triggered us because we couldn't travel, we couldn't commit any research or a lot of research, and we were therefore restricting ourselves to looking at the evidence out there. Of course, the other huge difference is going to be, I hope, and I think that we're going to invest even more in local evaluation capacity. I mean, we're already investing through the Global Evaluation Initiative of the World Bank, and our argumentation for continuing to do this is even stronger now. And I think it's a huge challenge, but it has to be done, and we will be using that local capacity much more, I think.
Thank you, Wendy. And the same question to Ricardo as well, please. In 60 seconds, any long-term implications?
Okay, so basically, as the president of the school where I used to study says, you either resist, adapt, or die nowadays in the function. And I think that's the time for evaluation is right now. It's not when the pandemic is over, as Michael Quinn-Patton puts it. Now, there's a huge opportunity to anchor learning and do system-wide initiatives, as we did back then with a joint evaluation for Rwanda, for the tech. Now comes COVID-19, where we can look into systemic issues. So strategic alliances to trigger learning across the system will be critical. Now, will evaluations be done always remotely and face to screen? I really hope not. And I think we're already re-engaging in mixed modalities, and that's very positive. Now, we need to break down the previous model of having just flown in, flown out evaluators. And I think the local evaluators and shifting the power to the national evaluators is critical, and it's a huge opportunity. To me, the major setback is around the SDGs. And how do we evaluate those in the current context? Because if you look at least this region, we're 30 years back in terms of social and economic development. Now, that will mean to resettle the goals, but also to put at the fore the measurement so that we know where we are, and increasing national evaluation capacities and national evaluation systems. Over to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. And thank you to all three of you for your interesting insights. And it was great to hear your reflections.